Welcome to the Intersectionality in the Archives, Making Black Queer Voices Accessible. I'm Danielle, the event coordinator for the student chapter of Society of American Archivists at San Jose State University. We are happy to have Bridgett Pride here today. She is the Reference Librarian for the Manuscripts, Archives, and Rare Books Division of the Schomburg Center for Research and Black Culture at the New York Public Library. And so Bridgett will tell us about the LGBTQ research guide that has been instrumental in making collections for Black queer voices accessible. So thank you, Bridgett, for being here today.
Thank you. I'm going to attempt to share my screen with you all. Let's see. And share. Okay, can everyone see everything all right? Should be a purple slideshow. Yep. Great, thank you. So welcome. I'm very excited to share with you all this presentation that really came out of my work as a reference librarian at the Schomburg Center. And so I'm going to start off by giving you guys a little bit of history about the Schomburg Center and what it is that we collect. And then talk about my inspiration for this research guide, things I learned, and things I'd like you all to be thinking of as you embark on your journey as information professionals. So here we go. So the Schomburg Center was started as an inspiration that came out of the work of Arturo Alfonso Schomburg. So Mr. Schomburg is a biracial gentleman of Puerto Rican descent, and he moved to the United States in 1891. And he is mostly known as a bibliophile during the Harlem Renaissance. So he was growing up in Puerto Rico. One of his teachers told him that Black people didn't have any history or culture worthy of being studied. And so he then spent his life traveling the globe, collecting vindicating evidences. So these are evidences or proof that Black people are intelligent and creative and are geniuses in their own right and have history and culture that are worthy of being collected and studied. So he sold a huge portion of his collection to the New York Public Library in 1926. That collection was cataloged at our downtown library branch, known as the Stephen A. Schwartzman Building, or SAASC for short. That's our library with the lions. So it was cataloged there and then was deposited at the 135th Street Branch Library in Harlem, now known as the County Cullen Library. And this was a non-circulating reference collection known as the Collection of Negro History, Literature, Art, and Prints. And Mr. Schomburg was actually the second curator of this collection from 1932 until he passed away in 1938. And the collection soon outgrew the 135th Street Branch Library into the Schomburg Center. So today, the Schomburg Center for Research in Black Culture is one of 3 research libraries within the New York Public Library system. And we are actually a super unique library. We are organized by format, and we have 5 research divisions. So we have an art and artifacts division where you can find sculpture and painting, drawings, political button collection, shackles that enslaved persons were forced to wear. We also have a moving image and recorded sound division, which is where you can find Black film, a massive record collection, as well as audio interviews of famous Black folks. We also have a photographs and prints division. Our Jean Blackwell Hudson Research and Reference Division is where you would find your more typical library fare, so published books, newspapers, periodicals, access to all of our databases. And then we have the Manuscripts, Archives, and Rare Books Division, which is where all of our unpublished materials live. So my division holds over 950 processed collections, and these again are unpublished personal papers, records of organizations and institutions, subject or thematic collections, literary and scholarly typescripts, play scripts, sheet music, programs, playbills, ephemera, and of course, rare books. And this is a photograph of our reading room, which has sadly been empty since March 13th, but it's a really beautiful reading room. So the Schomburg Center is a public library. So we serve all sorts of people from all around the globe. People travel from everywhere to come do research at the Schomburg Center. We see a lot of scholars of the Black diaspora, filmmakers, playwrights, authors, students of all ages. I've worked with fourth graders, I've worked with high school students, graduate students, everybody, faculty, journalists, and basically anyone who has an interest in coming to the Schomburg Center to do research may apply for a free New York Public Library card and come do their research with us. And it's my job to help our researchers find what they need, no matter where they are from. So we have a bunch of different tools that we use to help our researchers do their research. So we share a catalog with all of the New York Public Library. And we have like over 90 branch libraries on top of our 3 research libraries. So it's a lot of ground to cover. We have our archives portal, which is where all of our finding needs live. And then we have our digital collections, which is a living database where everything that has been digitized from our collections lives, where folks can search very similarly to the catalog, except they'll be finding that digital content rather than call numbers in order to check out books. But the individual research libraries also create their own tools based off of the needs of the materials that they serve. So in my division, we have what I call the Bible of the division, which is the list of collections organized by subject. And I've actually included a screen grab of this 43-page PDF of all of our collections that have been cataloged and are open to researchers. And I've opened this up to our queer studies subject heading, which I'll go into in more detail in just a moment. But what this document does is it's all hyperlinked to either the finding aid or the catalog record, because believe it or not, the internet is still a little bit new to the New York Public Library. So not all of our finding aids are actually online yet, but we do have catalog records for all of our collections. So we encourage our researchers to start with this list of collections categorized by subject, because it really serves as an overarching search for research. So if you know you're interested in LGBTQ studies or queer studies, as we call it, you can just go through this alphabetical list of subject headings in order to find relevant collections. Now, our collections will show up under as many subject headings as apply to them. So you're not going to miss anything by looking under one subject heading versus another. But that can be a little sticky sometimes, and I'll get into that in a few minutes. The other research tool that my division is responsible for are our own research guides, or LibGuides. And these get created by either myself or one of my colleagues based off of specific topics or collections that we feel require more in-depth information to be made available about them. So usually it's a broader topic such as LGBTQ studies or specific arts movements or artists that might have collection material across multiple divisions at the Schomburg Center or multiple libraries within the New York Public Library. So today I'm going to be talking primarily about our queer studies collections. So I came across the need to create a research guide about these collections because when I started at the Schomburg Center almost 2 years ago, they were celebrating Stonewall 50. So they were celebrating the 50th anniversary of the Stonewall riots. And this celebration was taking place at the downtown library, SAASC. And they had this massive exhibition going where they were showing all kinds of collections that they had recently purchased and processed out of a grant that they had acquired. And one thing I discovered was that there wasn't really any representation of Black voices within these collections, and certainly not women's voices. And that's something that I realized that we needed to be aware of, not just across New York Public Library, but even at the Schomburg Center. So our collections that we have been designated as the Queer Studies collections are 24 collections, and they are about LGBTQ topics. They are all created by members of the LGBTQ community, but the collection actually has to talk about queerness as a subject in order for them to be given the subject heading. So an example I like to use of someone who doesn't qualify in this category is James Baldwin, because while we do have his papers at the Schomburg do not discuss his identity as a Black gay man. They only identify his identity as a Black author. So these collections are going to talk about LGBTQ plus topics, but not every LGBTQ community member with a collection at the Schomburg Center might be in this category. The other thing I learned when I was organizing this research guide is that most of the collections were created by men. There were very few collections that talked about Black women who were members of the LGBTQ community. I also learned that the collections were primarily from the 1960s to the early 2000s. So at the Schomburg Center, a huge portion of our collections deal with the Harlem Renaissance. And there were many, many figures of the Harlem Renaissance who may have identified within the LGBTQ community, but those collections are not represented here. So I learned a lot of things when I was creating this guide. So I learned about the grant. I learned about the creators of the content are not usually identified as creators of are not usually identified, sorry. And I learned how to distinguish properly between the study of LGBTQ communities and being a member of the LGBTQ communities. And my major takeaway was that we need to be intentional about using identifying language so that our researchers don't get confused. I even get confused trying to explain what's going on here. So we have to make sure that we are practicing enough in order to explain what exactly our researchers are going to find when they're using our tools. And I also want to point out that I've included the URL to the research guide here if any of you are interested in taking a look at the research guide on your own time. So I had to learn to make things clear. So I had to explain how this tool worked. And I do that on the second page of the research guide, where I painstakingly, after many, many drafts, think I figured out an acceptable way to explain that the queer studies list identifies collections created by LGBTQIA plus individuals and organizations about the study of queerness. But this distinction does not identify every collection within the Manuscripts, Archives, and Rare Books division created by a person or organization that identifies within that community. I also wanted to make sure that if a researcher is looking for materials about a member of the LGBTQIA plus community, we don't actually have a solid subject heading that will do that work of identifying that person if their collection does not specify that it is about queerness. So in order to be as clear as possible, I gave examples of how to help researchers find what they were looking for. So I went through every single collection at the Schomburg that was in the queer studies list and found all of the subject headings that were used in order to identify these collections. And I even slipped over into some of the collections that were not within the Schomburg Center because we're constantly growing and evolving. And if this language is being used across the New York Public Library, it would certainly make its way over into the Schomburg Center. I also wanted to make sure that I was educating our users about the use of appropriate subject headings for this content, because before 1970s, terms having to do with LGBTQ studies collections were really demoralizing. These materials may have been cataloged as abnormal sexual relations or criminal behavior or even mental illness. And that's just not something that we want to be promoting as information professionals. We want to be empowering our users and teaching our users and teaching them facts and not foregone opinions about who our collections are about and what that may mean. So as I go through the research guide, I show people the collections within each of the divisions that have to do with these collections and these individuals and these organizations. But then I also introduce our users to resources outside of the New York Public Library because there's so many resources available that are both open source online resources that people can access from their home, which is especially important now. But then also I wanted to share other archives and libraries outside of the New York Public Library that specifically specialize in LGBTQ plus collections and organization of that material. It's important to understand that our institutions usually will not have all of the answers. And our researchers are very often going to be asking questions outside of the purview of our institution. So if we can connect them to that next step, then that will help them be better researchers. It also helps us build our network of community members within the information community. So knowing archivists and librarians at other institutions that share in the same collection habits as your institution is very helpful. So it's great when you can point to your users and build those connections for your users. So I also want to mention that there's a lot of work still to be done. I created this research guide several months ago, and I've created other research guides since, and I'm still talking about this guide just because I learned so much about it. It was a harrowing experience to realize that Black women have been left out of the conversation at the institution that I work at. And so I feel it's really important to show up for your identity, bring it to work with you, but also make sure that you have those barriers in place and engage in self-care when it becomes exhausting, because it will. So it's a really short presentation because I wanted to leave time for questions. I had a couple of questions come in before I put together this presentation. So I just want to go over those now. So the first question was, what is your process for classifying different types of content to make sure they are found under the right search queries? So this isn't something that I actually do in my work at the Schomburg Center. I am the reference librarian, so 100% of my work is working directly with researchers and just showing them how our tools work. But I'm not actually involved in the process of cataloging. So we have our wonderful processing archivists who do that work. And so they are in charge of arranging and describing our collection materials. And in their work with that, they are doing tons and tons of research to provide context for each of the collections. And then they're actually looking at all of the content to get a read on what the collection is actually describing. So again, the person who cataloged James Baldwin was able to bring that information that they surely knew that Mr. Baldwin identified as a gay Black man. But because his collection did not discuss that, they made the decision to not include those subject headings within that collection. Was that the right choice? I don't actually know. I would personally probably say no, because as the person who is actually working with the researchers and I am understanding what our researchers are coming in and asking for, hey, I would like to do research on LGBTQ people during the Harlem Renaissance, we don't have the search terms in place to actually conduct that search. You'd actually have to go to another institution or Google search to find out who were queer people during the Harlem Renaissance, take that list of names, and then do a revised search at the Schomburg Center. So there's a deep discussion to be had there with that question. And then the next question was, are there any opportunities for virtual learning? And so what I think this question is asking is, how do you do research virtually? And so we have a whole bunch of different resources. We have the New York Public Library Catalog, the Archives portal, which again is where all of our finding aids live. We have our digital collections. We have our Schomburg Web Archives, which is a brand new thing that just became live this past year, where we are archiving Black culture on the internet. This started with the #syllabus movement. And then we also have virtual programs that get recorded and stored online for people to watch in their own time. And then we have, I host virtual archive visits and classes. And so in order to schedule one of those, you just have to email me. And as long as I have time, I will usually say yes. So now I would like to open it up to any other questions that you all have.
Okay, we actually have stuff in the chat. So the first question here is, let's see, was there collaboration in the creation and review of the guide, as well as feedback received on what it looks like?
Yeah, so the guide is primarily my work. We have been very busy at the Schomburg Center since we've closed down to the public. And so basically, I started by doing a search in the catalog and in the archives portal. And then I sent my first draft of the guide to either the reference librarian in the other divisions or the curator and got feedback. In one case, I didn't hear from them, but the guide still got published. And then my supervisor, the curator of the Manuscripts, Archives, and Rare Books division, did a final go over of the guide, and she had the final okay. So it was collaborative, but it was primarily me doing the legwork.
Okay, thank you for that. The next question is, who are the users of this material and what are they usually looking for?
So users of specifically the queer collections, I think?
Yes, I believe so, yeah.
Okay. So it's a lot of college students. They're the ones that ask the most questions, I should say. So they're the ones that would come in or email me and specifically say, I'm writing a paper on this topic. And a lot of them are looking for performers. And a lot of the time they're looking for women, which again are not well represented in this classification.
Okay, the next question is, how do you publicize and market your collections?
So our social media person, when we have a new collection that has become available, we will usually email her and she will post about it on our Facebook or our Instagram, and I think we even have a Twitter. We also have a monthly publication called the Schomburg Connection, which you can subscribe to. It is free to subscribe. And that will usually have some sort of mention of new collections. We also write blog posts about new collections that become available. And certainly when I create research guides, grouping collections together, I'll usually write a blog post about that. And then the research guide will be publicized as well.
Okay, thank you. The next question is, are you aware of any efforts to change the way the Library of Congress classifies and assigns subject headings to intersectional material?
I am not aware of that, no.
It's a very good question. I think we all want to know that. So,
Yeah.
what has been the most rewarding part of your job?
Oh goodness. I love the teaching aspect of my work. I have a ton of fun meeting with students and young librarians or future librarians, and just kind of picking apart problems or I'm really miss encouraging people to like pick up and touch archival collections when they've never been to an archive before. That is magical. Just watching people's faces light up when I hand them a book from the 1700s or whatever. Like that is very cool. And I cannot wait until it is safe to do that in person again.
I agree. Okay, the next question is, one of our attendees is curious about the addition to metadata in digital collections and wants to know how she can make her diverse images findable by everyone.
Okay, so the thing about the New York Public Library is we are very siloed in our departments. So I don't actually know who works in digital collections because it is very far removed from the work that I do day to day. So I guess like my advice is just looking at metadata at different institutions. Um, every institution is going to have their own like thesaurus for terms that they use within their metadata. So reach far and wide to see what different institutions are doing. Look in different states, look in different countries, really stretch the bounds of the limitations for that so that you can get a broad sense of the language that people are using.
Okay, thank you. And you addressed earlier any outreach activities that you're doing, but another attendee had a question about how you attract new collections and donations.
So that again is not something that I personally get to do. We get a lot of material donated because we are one of the premier institutions for Black history and culture in the world. So we get a lot of requests to take material, a lot of donations, but we will purchase things at auction sometimes. A couple of years ago, we purchased the lost chapter draft of The Negro from the autobiography of Malcolm X. So there were 3 chapters that were not included in the final draft. And we have one of them at the Schomburg that we purchased. But otherwise, the majority of our collections are actually donated.
That's pretty amazing.
Yeah.
Okay, our next question is, what does bringing your identity to work look like for you, and how can an aspiring person of color librarian stand in solidarity with you?
Yeah, so I mean, I have the great privilege of working at a Black institution. So as a queer Black woman who grew up in Southern California, I moved to Boston for graduate school, which was painful in so many ways. It's very cold here, but also not welcoming to people of color. And the institution I attended had 2 instructors who were part of the BIPOC community. And that was super disheartening. And even worse so when you looked at the track record for the institution and how they couldn't manage to hold on to any of those instructors or administrators. So knowing your limits, building your community is so important. When I was in graduate school, I was in a students of color group, student group, and we hosted a whole bunch of social events for the students of color that were at the institution so that we could build our own community. There's also professional organizations that do the same. And those have been invaluable to be a part of and to build community. If you are having trouble at your job because you're not being recognized as a whole human because a part of your identity is marginalized by the people that you're working with, get out if you can. I mean, other folks have other ideas about that. But I was able to leave some institutions and go to the Schomburg Center where I get to celebrate being Black every day. which is so affirming. And thankfully, I also am safe in my institution to where I can also celebrate being queer every day. And I mean, if you can do that, please do, but do so safely, and don't let it drain you.
That is very good advice. Thank you for sharing that. And I really think it's extremely important to build community. So thank you for touching upon that. Okay, the next question is, what was the most surprising find in a good way?
Oh, surprising find in in a specific collection. Can you tell me more?
The question is pretty generic. So let's say, what is the most surprising find in the collection that you're specifically working in?
Oh, let's see. I mean, there's so many wonderful pieces. I think one of my favorite pieces at the Schomburg is this playbill that is part of the Lorraine Hansberry papers. And it's a playbill from A Raisin in the Sun that Langston Hughes went to see. And for those of you who don't know, the title "A Raisin in the Sun" came from a Langston Hughes poem, and he went to see this play, and they were best friends, by the way. They were like, it's so great because we have both of their collections, so you can read their correspondence to each other, and it's so cute. But he went to see this play, and then he had this playbill, and he wrote her a note on it. And it says something, I'm paraphrasing because it's been a while, but it says something about like, you've written such a beautiful play. Everyone around me is in tears because it's so good. You did such a great job. Well done. And it's in her collection, and it's so touching to see like their friendship play out in the archive. And actually, 2 years ago, I think, right after I first started, we had a playwright come to the Schomburg Center and do this intense study of their two archives and wrote a play titled Sweet Lorraine, about their friendship. And it's such a wonderful, like, magical thing that came out of the Schomburg. And I love sharing that with people.
I think that's amazing. That's a great story. I love it when things like that happen. Okay, the next question is, what made you excited when you were putting the guide together?
Oh, so many things. Like it was, I mean, the guide was in part like created out of spite. Like I was so upset that that Black voices had been silenced to begin with. Like this huge project had like taken place, and Black voices were just left out of it. And so it was so wonderful to like work on this guide, and like so frustrating at the same time. Because even after I created the guide, like there were people who were like, oh, you can't use the word queer, or oh, you can't say this, that's incorrect, or, and it was just like, really, like, are you part of this community? No, I didn't think so. And like I just felt like I kept getting checked, and like it was so frustrating. And by the end of it, I was just like, you know what, like whatever, I will make whatever changes you say are required. Because the important thing is that this guide is out in the world, because people need this guide. And this guide does so much more than anything else, for Black folks within this community. So like, here it is. And so I'm glad that it exists now. And now I get to talk about it with everyone who wants to know.
I think everyone is really enjoying this presentation and learning about the guide. So thank you for doing all of this hard work. And so, okay, the next question is, what are the biggest challenges you face, I believe, in your work on a daily basis?
Time management, man. Like I'm a person who does procrastinate. I must admit. So having enough time to do all of the projects that I'm interested in doing. I probably have a list of about 15 research guides that I want to be building. But it also takes like around 3 months to make one, just because of the level of research I have to do and the amount of searching I have to do, on top of like meeting with researchers and answering emails and like doing so many other things. So it's hard to have appropriate time management when you're doing something that you love and something that you're like super nerdy about. um, so I think that's my personal greatest challenge.
I think that time management is almost everyone's personal, like, greatest challenge. So I'm actually right there with you on that. Okay, the next question is, what do you think the LIS community should do to encourage more people of color to pursue a career in librarianship? And do
Oh
you
god,
think that requiring a master's is an obstacle?
it is absolutely an obstacle. 100%. Also they're so expensive. Like it's crazy. I also like I often talk about how like library school was just a hoop I had to jump through. I I got more training on the job during graduate school at the college library that I attended, than I ever did in a classroom. Like classrooms are great for theory, but like it was so much theory and nothing was based strongly enough in the realities of what you're doing every day. Um, so I absolutely agree that the master's degree is a deterrent to people of color becoming librarians. You can absolutely learn how to be a librarian by being a librarian. I think customer service experience is probably the most important thing about being a librarian. You have to learn how to talk to people and how to ask them questions so that they can figure out what it is that they need. And you have to learn how to talk to people with kindness, so that when they are coming to you with a question that they may have a whole spectrum of feelings about, that you can approach them in an empathetic and compassionate way, without talking down to them. Um, so there, I mean, there, I do see at the same time value in the education. It's important to learn the history of where these subject terms are coming from. It's important to learn that libraries are tools of white supremacy in a lot of ways. And it's important to understand like the history of what it is we're doing so that we can tear down those barriers and create more equitable experiences in libraries for everyone.
Thank you so much for that insight. Like, my mind has been just open to so many things right now. So, okay, what motivated or inspired you to pursue a career in library and information science?
So I started as a literature major when I went to undergrad back in 2005 or something. I don't know. And I knew I liked books. I knew I loved to read. I thought I was going to be an author. That was my goal when I was very young. But I also loved history. I went to college too soon, I think. I did not do well in college the first time around. And then I started taking history classes and I learned that's what I was really passionate about. So I somehow squeaked through my literature degree. I went and got a history degree after taking a couple of years off. And one of my sorority sisters actually inspired me. We were working in the bookstore one day, and she's like, "Hey, like, what are you doing after this?" I was like, I don't know. We'll see. Maybe I'll like write something. I don't know." And she encouraged me to go to library school, and she told me about being an archivist. And that was really cool. And I was really interested in preservation because I am like an arts and crafts type of person. And so I was really enamored with the idea of putting books back together once like their covers had been separated from them. That sounded really interesting to me. And so I ended up applying to graduate school after a couple of years. I finished my history BA. The program I went into allowed me to get a double master's in history and also archival science, archival management. And so I was able to do them both at the same time. And I was really dedicated to finding similar people of similar backgrounds in the archive. As a historian, I all the time was searching for Black women and queer Black women, and they are few and far between. So I wanted to dedicate my study to making sure that their voices were accessible in the archive and within the historical narrative. So that's that's why I do this work.
That truly is an amazing journey. So thank you for sharing that with us. Our last question, I believe it's our last question in the chat. If anyone wants to jump in and ask Bridgett a question after this one, you can unmute yourself and then ask directly. This one says, what other guides are currently in the works or that you hope to work in the future?
So I actually just finished a guide on, it's called By Any Means Necessary, Black Protest in the Archive. And this was how I was reacting to the murder of George Floyd this past summer, and Breonna Taylor and everyone else. And so it's a research guide that documents Black folks protesting the institutional racism that has been a primary backbone of the United States and the world. So it starts with slave insurrections, it covers civil rights, it goes into the Black Power movement, it touches on gay liberation, and it will be updated as we continue to collect materials. There was a wonderful art installation created by folks in Harlem after George Floyd was murdered. And so we've collected those pieces left by the community, and those will be cataloged and added to the Schomburg Center's collection so people can view those in years to come. I am currently working on a Harlem Renaissance research guide. We often call ourselves the Library of the Harlem Renaissance, and yet we don't have like a research guide that really tells that story. So I'm working on that. I'm hoping to put together a Black Arts Movement research guide, something about performers. We have a huge number of collections that celebrate Black performers, whether they be dancers, musicians, actors. We have the American Negro Theater on site at the Schomburg Center, which is where famous folks such as Harry Belafonte got their start, and Sidney Poitier. So the Schomburg is such a relic in itself. We are there's so much that can be done, and it's just managing your time appropriately so you can build these tools that becomes the hard part.
It really is. The Schomburg Center truly is a relic. I agree with you there. If anyone wants to jump in and unmute themselves and ask Bridgett a question, you can. And if not, you can still type in the chat. We do have a few minutes left to answer questions. If you don't have any questions, then we will say goodbye to lovely Bridgett and this wonderful presentation. So are there any more questions?
Bridgett, I just want to say your cat looks so amazingly comfortable, and it's like the perfectly round circle. I was like, oh, that looks so comfy right now. But
Yeah,
thank you.
I was stay there.
I know. That was so exciting. I learned so much just exploring the LibGuide, and just from everything you shared with us tonight. That was fantastic. I really appreciate it.
You're welcome. It's my pleasure.
And then Barbara, if you don't mind popping in all our contact info for SAASC so everyone knows where they can find the recording later, our website, our Twitter feed, all that great stuff. Oh, we got a request for the LibGuide, so I will pop that into the chat right now. It's so great. I had so much fun exploring it. I'm gonna start with the home page. Give me 1 second, everyone.
And Bridgett, I just wanted to say that I really appreciated your presentation, and everything that you kind of put together has been really inspirational for me. So thank you.
You're welcome.
Yeah, I think as we all sort of are in different spots in our MLIS journey, it's really exciting to see and hear from different groups of people that are doing really important work. I've been really inspired by the CritLib movement. So I just think there's so much more that as librarians and information professionals we can be doing to make people better informed and more aware of like the bias that are in libraries everywhere and information that people are receiving.
Absolutely. No, our work is far from over. So
absolutely
a lot for us to continue doing.
Samantha, anything else you want to cover before we wrap up?
I don't have anything in particular, but if no one has any questions, I'd like to thank you, Bridgett, for this awesome and informative presentation, and for all of you who are tuning in.